Stop what you are doing. Understand that what happened this Monday morning in Madrid is not a diplomatic footnote, not a routine expression of European discomfort with American foreign policy, and not the kind of carefully worded ministerial statement that gets issued for domestic consumption and forgotten by the afternoon news cycle. What Spanish Defense Minister Margarita Robles said on national television at 9:47 Madrid time is the most significant public rupture inside the Western alliance since France refused to join the Iraq War in 2003, not a whisper of dissent through back channels, not a carefully hedged communiqué released through a Brussels intermediary, a sitting defense minister of a NATO member state on live national television called the President of the United States senseless, called the war absurd, said that neither Trump nor Netanyahu can impose their own rules on the international community, and did it on a Monday morning in plain language with the cameras running and the entire world watching. That statement cannot be unsaid. That fracture cannot be unopened. The Western alliance that has been the foundational architecture of global security for 75 years cracked publicly this morning, and the crack runs deeper than anything a single press conference can repair. This is not about Spain. That is the first thing to understand and the most important thing to resist getting wrong. Spain is not a peripheral actor whose dissent can be absorbed by the alliance without consequence. Spain is the fourth largest economy in the Eurozone. Spain hosts Naval Station Rota, one of the most strategically critical American forward deployment facilities in the entire European theater, the base through which American naval power projects into the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, and the approaches to the Middle East. Spain is a founding member of NATO whose military cooperation with the United States involves not just treaty commitments but active operational integration at a level that makes Robles' statements not merely political commentary, but a signal with direct military implications that every NATO planner in Brussels and every Pentagon strategist in Washington is reading right now with a level of alarm that the official non-responses are designed to conceal. When Spain's defense minister calls American policy senseless on live television, the question is not whether she is right or wrong. The question is what it means for the architecture of Western power when the people responsible for maintaining that architecture begin saying publicly what they have been saying privately for months. The irreversible fact of this morning is this: the consensus that has held the Western alliance together through the opening phase of this war, the carefully maintained public solidarity that allowed European governments to express private reservations while maintaining official support for the American position, is gone. Robles did not resign. She was not speaking off the record. She was not a backbench parliamentarian with no operational authority. She is Spain's defense minister. She spoke on the record, and her government has not walked back a single word in the hours since the interview aired. What existed before 9:47 Madrid time this morning, a Western alliance with visible cracks but maintained public coherence, no longer exists in the same form. What exists now is something different, something more dangerous, and something that the crisis in Islamabad, already hanging by the thread of a disputed ceasefire, cannot absorb without consequences that nobody in Washington has yet publicly acknowledged. Let us talk about what Spain's position inside the Western alliance actually means in concrete operational terms, because the strategic weight of this morning's statement requires translation into numbers and capabilities before its full significance can land. Naval Station Rota, located on Spain's Atlantic coast near Cadiz, is not a minor logistics facility. It is the forward home port of 4 Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers, the backbone of American ballistic missile defense in the European theater. It hosts the command infrastructure for American naval operations across a geographic arc stretching from the North Atlantic through the Strait of Gibraltar and into the Mediterranean approaches. Approximately 4,000 American military personnel and their families are stationed at Rota on any given day. The base processes a volume of American military logistics that, if interrupted or complicated by a deterioration in Spanish-American relations, would require a rerouting of assets and supply chains whose cost in time, money, and operational readiness cannot be quickly recovered. 4,000 personnel, 4 Arleigh Burke destroyers, one statement from one defense minister. The mathematics of that equation do not favor the American position. The broader NATO context compounds the significance in ways that the single country framing obscures. Spain is not alone in the position Robles articulated this morning. She is the first defense minister to say it on live television with her name attached. She is not the first European defense official to hold the view. German officials have been communicating versions of the same assessment through private diplomatic channels for weeks. French strategic analysts, whose government has maintained a more careful public posture, have been writing in terms that parallel Robles's language in everything but its directness. The Italian government, hosting its own American military installations, whose operational future depends on alliance cohesion, has been threading a rhetorical needle so fine that it constitutes its own form of dissent. What Robles did this morning was not invent a European position. She made the European position visible. And a position that is visible cannot be managed the way a position that remains private can be managed. The gap between what European governments say publicly and what they believe strategically just narrowed by a distance that changes the negotiating environment in Islamabad, changes the domestic political calculus in Washington, and changes the question that every American ally in every theater is now asking about the durability of the commitments that underpin their security. 3 questions will drive everything that follows, and none of them have answers that the official communications of any government involved in this crisis are prepared to deliver honestly. First, how did the Western alliance reach the specific and structurally dangerous configuration where a NATO defense minister felt not only justified but compelled to call American policy senseless on national television? And what does the sequence of decisions that produced that moment reveal about the actual state of transatlantic consensus on this war? Second, what does Spain's public break mean in precise operational and strategic terms for the American military posture in Europe and the Mediterranean? And what are the real consequences if the fracture widens from a single ministerial statement into a formal policy divergence that other European governments feel licensed to join? Third, with the Islamabad talks already under maximum strain, with the ceasefire disputed, with the Strait of Hormuz partially closed, and now with the Western alliance visibly fracturing at the moment when American diplomatic leverage most requires the appearance of unified Western backing, is there any realistic path through this crisis that does not end in a strategic defeat for the American position, so comprehensive that it reshapes the global order for a generation? The truth is worth saying. Here it is, Part 1. How the alliance arrived at a Monday morning in Madrid where a defense minister said what nobody was supposed to say out loud. The fracture that became visible this morning did not begin this morning. It began accumulating in the first weeks of the war, in the closed briefings, where European defense ministers received American assessments of the conflict's objectives and timelines that did not match the reality they were watching unfold in real time, in the humanitarian casualty figures coming out of Lebanon that European foreign ministries were being asked to contextualize as collateral costs of a necessary military operation while their own populations demanded a different accounting, and in the economic damage reports from their own finance ministries documenting the cost to European economies of an oil crisis that European governments had not been consulted about before the military operations that produced it were launched. The disconnect between what Washington was telling its European allies privately and what those allies were observing publicly was not small, it was structural. And structural disconnects in alliances do not resolve themselves through patience. They accumulate until someone says what everyone has been thinking. The specific mechanism through which Robles' statement became possible is worth examining with precision, because it reveals something important about how alliance discipline breaks down and why the breakdown, once it starts, accelerates in ways that are very difficult to reverse. The mechanism was permission, not permission granted by Washington. Permission granted by the accumulated weight of events that made the cost of continued silence higher than the cost of speaking. European governments had been maintaining public solidarity with the American position on the war through a calculation that the costs of open dissent, the diplomatic friction, the American reaction, the risk of being isolated within the alliance, exceeded the costs of private disagreement expressed through quiet channels. That calculation held as long as the war appeared to be moving toward a resolution that would allow European governments to point to the outcome as justification for the solidarity they had maintained. When the ceasefire arrived disputed, when Lebanon continued to burn, when the strait remained closed, when the Islamabad talks began under conditions of maximum uncertainty, the calculation shifted. The cost of continued silence, measured in domestic political legitimacy, in credibility with populations watching the humanitarian catastrophe, in the judgment of history that every serious politician eventually thinks about, exceeded the cost of speaking. Robles spoke, The permission, once granted by one minister in one country, is now available to every European official who has been sitting on the same assessment. The timeline of how this specific statement came to be delivered on this specific Monday morning is itself revealing. The interview was scheduled on Friday, April 11th at 3:22 in the afternoon Madrid time, according to the RTV scheduling records. The briefing that preceded it, the conversation between Robles and her senior advisors about the parameters of what she would and would not say on camera, lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. That is not a routine pre-interview preparation. That is a deliberate, strategic decision being made at the highest level of the Spanish defense establishment about whether and how to break from the alliance's public position. The decision that emerged from that briefing was not impulsive. It was calculated. And the calculation was that the Spanish government's domestic political position, its credibility with its own population on questions of war, international law, and human rights, required a public statement that its private diplomatic communications had not been able to deliver. Spain spoke publicly because private channels had produced nothing. That verdict on the effectiveness of private alliance communication is itself a verdict on the state of the alliance. The political failure that allowed this moment to arrive is not Spain's failure. Spain did not fail to maintain its position. Spain maintained its position for months through private channels and received nothing in return that changed the trajectory of the war or the humanitarian situation that was driving Spanish public opinion toward open condemnation. The failure is the failure of the American side to read the signals that its European allies had been sending through every available channel short of a live television statement, and to adjust its approach in ways that would have made today's statement unnecessary. Washington received those signals. Washington assessed that the cost of adjusting to European concerns was higher than the cost of European dissatisfaction. Washington was wrong. The cost of European dissatisfaction, as of 9:47 Madrid time this morning, is no longer a diplomatic inconvenience. It is a strategic liability that has arrived at the worst possible moment. Part 2. The 5 dimensions of alliance fracture. What NATO cohesion actually means operationally, and why its erosion cannot be managed the way Washington is currently attempting to manage it. Let us talk about NATO cohesion not as a political abstraction, but as a precise operational requirement, because the word cohesion gets used in alliance contexts as though it means general goodwill between governments, when what it actually means is a specific set of operational, logistical, intelligence sharing, and command integration arrangements whose effectiveness depends entirely on the political trust that underlies them. When that trust fractures, the operational consequences are not theoretical. They are measurable, immediate, and compounding in ways that no public statement from a NATO spokesperson can neutralize. The first dimension is intelligence sharing, and it is where fracture produces the fastest and most damaging operational consequences. NATO's intelligence architecture, the arrangement through which member states share signals intelligence, human intelligence, and analytical assessments across a common framework, operates on the assumption of political alignment between the parties sharing the intelligence. When a member state's government publicly characterizes the military operations of its primary alliance partner as senseless and absurd, the intelligence sharing relationship does not automatically terminate, but it changes. The quality of what is shared, the speed with which it is shared, the level of analytical detail that accompanies raw intelligence, all of these dimensions of the relationship are affected by the political temperature between the parties. Spain's signals intelligence collection posture in the Mediterranean and the Atlantic is not a minor input into American operational awareness. It is a significant contribution to the total picture. Its degradation, even partial, even temporary, costs the American side capabilities it cannot quickly replace from other sources. The second dimension is basing rights, and this is where the strategic stakes of Robles' statement become most concrete and most immediately alarming. Naval Station Rota operates under a bilateral defense agreement between the United States and Spain that requires periodic renewal and whose terms are subject to negotiation between the two governments. The current agreement is not up for renewal immediately, but agreements of this kind exist within a political environment that shapes their practical operation, regardless of their formal terms. A Spanish government that has publicly characterized American military policy as senseless is a Spanish government that will negotiate the next renewal of the Rota agreement from a political position, that its domestic audience expects to reflect the values it articulated on live television this morning. The formal agreement continues. The political environment in which it operates has changed. Those two facts are not in contradiction. They are the definition of how alliance relationships deteriorate without formally breaking, which is the most dangerous form of deterioration because it is the hardest to diagnose and the hardest to reverse. The third dimension is European Union coordination, and it operates on a timeline that makes the current moment particularly sensitive. The European Union is not a military alliance. It does not have the command structure or the treaty commitments of NATO. But it has an increasingly coherent foreign and security policy framework. And when a senior defense minister of a major EU member state characterizes an ongoing war as absurd on national television, the statement enters the EU foreign policy conversation with a force that no Brussels communiqué can neutralize. Other EU governments that have been maintaining carefully calibrated positions now face a choice that Robles' statement has made more difficult to avoid. Do they align with the Spanish position and accept the diplomatic cost of public distance from Washington? Or do they maintain their public solidarity with the American position and accept the domestic political cost of being visibly out of step with a European colleague who said what their own populations have been saying for months? Neither option is costless. Both options are now forced by a statement that has already been made and cannot be retracted. The fourth dimension is the precedent effect, and it is the one that Washington will find hardest to manage, because precedent operates through imitation, and imitation has no off switch once it begins. Before this morning, the precedent within the alliance was that public dissent from the American position on this war, however strongly felt, was expressed through private channels. That precedent is now broken. Robles broke it. The question is not whether the precedent is broken. It is whether other European defense ministers, foreign ministers, and heads of government will follow through the opening that the broken precedent creates. The answer, based on the private assessments of every European diplomatic source whose views are being tracked in Washington right now, is that they will. Not all of them. Not immediately. But the permission has been granted. And permissions granted in alliance politics spread in the same direction that the political wind is blowing. The wind in Europe is blowing away from public solidarity with a war that European populations find indefensible and European governments find strategically incoherent. The fifth dimension is the message sent to non-Western audiences, and it is the dimension that carries the longest-term strategic consequences for American global power. The non-Western world, the global South, as it has come to be called in the diplomatic vocabulary of the current era, has been watching the Western response to this war with the analytical precision of observers who have spent decades studying the gap between what Western governments say about international law and human rights, and what they do when the costs of upholding those principles become inconvenient. Robles said this morning that respect for international law is essential and fundamental, and that neither Trump nor Netanyahu can impose their own rules on the international community. That statement, coming not from a Chinese foreign ministry spokesman or a Russian diplomatic cable, but from the defense minister of a Western NATO member state, carries an evidentiary weight in the non-Western world that no American public diplomacy effort can counterbalance. When Spain says it, the argument that this war's critics are simply anti-Western propagandists collapses. The mathematics of global legitimacy shifted this morning. The shift is not reversible by a press release. Part 3. The response, what Washington said, what Madrid meant, and why the damage control operation that began within hours of the interview is failing in real time. The American response to Robles' statement arrived at 11:23 Washington time, 1 hour and 36 minutes after the interview aired in Spain. The response was 47 words delivered through a State Department spokesperson, and notable not for what it said, but for what it refused to say. The statement called for alliance unity in the face of shared challenges, reaffirmed the strength of the American-Spanish bilateral relationship, and expressed confidence that allied governments shared the objective of regional stability. It did not address a single substantive claim that Robles made. It did not respond to the characterization of the war as absurd. It did not respond to the assertion that Trump cannot impose his own rules on the international community. It did not respond to the accusation that the naval blockade threat is senseless. 47 words of diplomatic boilerplate delivered 1 hour and 36 minutes after the most significant public rupture in NATO's European southern flank in 2 decades. That response time and that content are themselves a statement. 1 hour and 36 minutes is long enough for the most senior communications officials in the American foreign policy apparatus to have read the interview, assessed its implications, consulted with the relevant regional bureau, and decided on a response strategy. The strategy they chose, 47 words of alliance unity boilerplate that addressed none of the substance, tells you exactly what Washington assessed about its options. There was no good response available. Engaging the substance of Robles' statement meant either defending the war's conduct in terms that would require acknowledging the humanitarian costs that European governments have been demanding acknowledgement of for months, or conceding the validity of her critique in ways that would embolden every other European government waiting to see whether speaking out carried consequences. Washington chose the option that carried the least immediate cost and the highest long-term cost. It said nothing meaningful and hoped the story would move on. The story has not moved on. Robles did not walk back her statement. Her government did not issue a clarifying note. The Spanish Prime Minister's office, which would have been the vehicle for walking back a Defense Minister's statement if the Spanish government had decided that the statement had gone too far, was silent. That silence is not ambiguous. A government that wanted to walk back a ministerial statement would walk it back within hours of its delivery, while the news cycle was still focused on the original statement, and the correction could be delivered with maximum effect. The correction window closed at approximately 14 o'clock Madrid time on Monday afternoon. No correction came. Spain said what it said, and it is standing behind it. Washington is responding with boilerplate and hoping for the best. That asymmetry between Spain's confidence in its position and Washington's inability to engage it substantively tells you more about the current state of the alliance than any formal diplomatic assessment. The branch analysis of where this goes from here closes every comfortable exit with the same efficiency that every other branch analysis in this crisis has closed them. If Washington engages Spain's critique directly and concedes any element of its validity, the concession is read by every other European government as confirmation that the alliance's public solidarity on this war was always a performance rather than a genuine consensus, and the performance ends with cascading consequences for the American diplomatic position at Islamabad and everywhere else. If Washington maintains its current posture of substantive non-engagement, the Spanish position hardens. Other European governments read the absence of consequences for Spain's dissent as a green light for their own, and the fracture widens in precisely the direction that American diplomacy in Islamabad most needs it not to widen. If Washington attempts to apply bilateral pressure on Spain through the Rota agreement, through NATO budget conversations, through any of the levers available to a superpower managing a smaller ally's behavior, the attempt becomes the story, and the story is an American superpower pressuring a European democracy for exercising free speech about an ongoing war. That story plays in every European capital in the worst possible way at the worst possible moment. Spain spoke, Washington has no good answer, the alliance is managing a fracture it did not prevent and cannot repair through any of the tools currently available to it. Part 4. The strategic implications. Why Madrid this morning is not a diplomatic incident but a civilizational verdict on the limits of American power in a multipolar world. There is a concept in international relations theory called hegemonic credibility, the capacity of a dominant power to maintain the compliance of other actors in the international system, not primarily through coercion, but through the shared belief that the dominant power's rules, norms, and leadership produce outcomes that are better for everyone than the alternatives. American hegemonic credibility has been the foundational asset of the post-Cold War international order. It is the reason that smaller states accepted American leadership even when they disagreed with specific American decisions. It is the reason that alliance commitments held even when they were costly. It is the reason that the rules-based international order, a phrase that appears in every Western foreign policy statement, and means in practice the set of norms that American power underwrites, commanded the genuine, if sometimes reluctant, assent of governments that understood that the order it described, however imperfect, was preferable to the disorder that its absence would produce. Robles said this morning that Trump cannot impose his own rules on the international community. That statement is not primarily about Trump. It is a verdict on hegemonic credibility. It is a European NATO defense minister saying publicly that the foundational premise of American alliance leadership, that American rules serve the international community's interests, is no longer accepted as a given. That verdict did not arrive suddenly this morning. It has been building across 2 decades of episodes whose cumulative effect has been to erode the credibility that American power once commanded as a matter of course. Iraq, Libya, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, the inconsistent application of international law to allies and adversaries, the weaponization of dollar-denominated financial systems in ways that accelerated the development of alternative financial architectures. Each of these episodes deposited a layer of skepticism in the accounts of every government that observed them. The account has now reached a point where a European defense minister calculates that saying the unsayable on live television carries lower political costs than continuing to maintain the silence that deference to American leadership requires. That calculation is the most consequential single data point in the current strategic environment. Not the missiles, not the oil prices, not the Islamabad talks. The calculation by a senior official of a Western democracy that speaking the truth about American policy carries lower costs than protecting the relationship. When that calculation changes, hegemonic credibility is not declining, it is gone. The 3 conventional responses available to Washington in managing a fracture of this kind have all been deployed before and all carry the same ceiling that limits their effectiveness. Reassurance, the attempt to restore confidence in American leadership through high-level bilateral engagement, works when the problem is a misunderstanding or a miscommunication. The problem here is not a misunderstanding. Robles understood the American position perfectly. She rejected it. Reassurance applied to a rejection is not reassurance. It is pressure dressed in diplomatic language, and pressure applied to a government that has already accepted the cost of public dissent does not produce compliance, it produces resentment. Compensation, the offer of bilateral benefits, economic or military or diplomatic, in exchange for a return to public solidarity, is available and will almost certainly be attempted. It carries its own cost. Every European government observing the compensation offer updates its model of how much public dissent from American policy is worth in bilateral benefits. The compensation that restores Spanish solidarity sets a price for dissent that every other potential dissenter immediately incorporates into their calculation. Isolation, the attempt to exclude Spain from the inner circle of alliance decision-making as a consequence of its public break, is the most dangerous option and the one most likely to be attempted informally while being denied officially. Isolating Spain within NATO does not change Spain's position, it confirms Spain's position. It tells every European government watching that the alliance relationship is conditional on silence about American policy failures, which is the confirmation that the critics of American alliance leadership have been waiting for. Washington deliberated, Madrid spoke. That antithesis contains the entire strategic situation of the Western alliance at this moment. A superpower that requires silence from its allies to maintain the appearance of consensus has lost something more fundamental than a single news cycle. It has lost the voluntary deference that consensus requires. The Islamabad talks are happening right now, this weekend, with an American delegation that needs to project the credibility of a unified Western position behind its diplomatic demands, and cannot project that position because the defense minister of a NATO ally called those demands senseless on live television this morning. The Iranian delegation in Islamabad knows what Robles said. The Russian Foreign Ministry issued a statement quoting her within 40 minutes of the interview airing. The Chinese state media translated her remarks into Mandarin within an hour and ran them with commentary that is already being read in every capital in the global south as confirmation of what those capitals have been saying about this war since it began. The open loops at the end of this analysis are not rhetorical devices. They are the actual condition of the strategic situation as it exists tonight. Nobody knows what the Islamabad talks will produce. Nobody knows whether the European fracture that became visible this morning will widen into a formal policy divergence or be managed back below the surface by the kind of bilateral damage control that alliance politics has always relied on. Nobody knows whether the Strait of Hormuz will be open or closed when the markets open tomorrow morning. Nobody knows whether the ceasefire in Lebanon will hold through the week or collapse under the weight of the contradictions that its drafters chose to defer rather than resolve. What everybody knows, what the Madrid statement made impossible to pretend otherwise, is that the architecture of Western solidarity that has underwritten American diplomatic leverage in every crisis since the end of the Cold War is operating under stress that it was not designed to absorb. The stress is visible now,